The wind carried the scent of river mud and wild sage that morning when the women led her down to the water. The sun was just rising over the distant ridges, spilling gold across the current that twisted through the valley like a living thing. Their skirts brushed the reeds, their boots sank into the damp earth, their voices trembled with something darker than anger. It was envy, old as the land itself, and colder than the river that waited below. She had never asked to be noticed. In that small, hard town where everyone knew everyone's sorrow, beauty was not a blessing, it was a danger. The men spoke her name softly, like they feared it might stir something forbidden. The women whispered it with bitterness, blaming her for glances their husbands never should have given. She worked alone, tending her small piece of land near the river, selling her bread and stitching clothes to survive. Yet even in silence, she drew eyes like a flame drew moths, and that was enough to make her unwelcome. Rumors spread through the town like wildfire through dry grass. They said she had bewitched the preacher's son. She met strangers at the water's edge at night, that her eyes carried some secret no one else could bear to look at. And in a place where sin was easier to believe than innocence. No one bothered to ask her side of the story. It began with whispers in the church, then turned to looks in the market, and finally hands that shoved and pulled. They waited until the morning after a storm, when the river ran high and fierce, to confront her. She didn't fight when they surrounded her. Maybe she thought reason would hold them back. Or maybe she had already grown tired of fighting for a place in a world that had decided she didn't belong. "You think you're better than us?" one of the women shouted, her face twisted with jealousy and fear. "You bring shame on decent folk. You steal hearts and hide behind that pretty face." The others murmured agreement, their eyes hard, their hearts beating with a strange satisfaction that comes only from shared cruelty. The one they hated most was trembling before them, her dark hair whipping across her face as the wind rose from the river. She tried to step back, but they closed in. "You don't belong here," another woman said, her voice sharp like broken glass. "Let the river take what you've stolen." Before she could speak, a rough hand pushed her shoulder. Then another. Her foot slipped on the slick stones. The cold water bit at her ankles, then her knees, then her waist as she stumbled. For a heartbeat she caught one woman's gaze, searching for a trace of mercy but found none. A final shove sent her falling into the current. The river swallowed her scream. It was not the soft, forgiving water of summer, but a raging force, fed by melted snow and swollen storms. The current spun her around, pulling her under and throwing her against hidden rocks. The weight of her dress dragged her deeper, and the world turned to silence and bubbles and light fading above. She thought it would be over. She welcomed it almost. For a moment, she stopped fighting. But someone broke through that silence. A hand reached into the storm. Strong and steady, gripping her arm with the certainty of life itself. She didn't see his face, only the rough skin against her wrist and the force that pulled her up through the darkness. She gasped as her head broke the surface, coughing and shivering, her vision blurring with light. The river still roared around them, yet the hand never let go. "Hold on," a voice said, low and urgent. "Don't let go." He dragged her toward the shallows, fighting the current until they both collapsed on the gravel bank. The wind whipped through the valley, carrying the echoes of the women's retreating steps. They had watched from above, frozen in disbelief, their cruelty unraveling as they realized she had survived. She turned her head weakly toward the stranger. His clothes were soaked, his hair plastered against his forehead, his chest rising with the rhythm of someone who had fought death and won. There was a scar across his jaw, a mark of a man who had known both pain and mercy. He looked at her not with pity, but with quiet resolve, as though he understood what it meant to be hunted by the world for reasons you never chose. The sun climbed higher, warming their trembling bodies. The river that had nearly taken her now whispered at their feet, its voice softer, almost forgiving. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone. But fear lingered beneath her breath, fear of what those women would say now, of what vengeance might come next. The town would not forgive her survival easily. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice hoarse. "Why did you help me?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the water, the light dancing on its surface, then back at her. "Because I've seen too many good souls lost to this river," he said. "And because something in me couldn't let it take you too." There was weight in his words, something that hinted at his own story, one filled with loss, perhaps exile. His horse waited on the far bank, saddled and still, like it had watched the whole thing unfold. She tried to sit up, but pain flared through her ribs. He steadied her again, that same hand firm, careful keeping her from falling. "You should rest," he said quietly. "You're safe now." But she knew that wasn't true. Safety in that land was a fragile thing, especially for someone who had just been marked by shame and survival in the eyes of those who had tried to erase her. Word would spread faster than the river's flow. The women would twist the story, say she'd cast another spell, that even the current had refused to take her. And yet, as she looked at the stranger who had saved her, she felt something stir that defied fear. Gratitude, yes, but also an unfamiliar sense of strength. She had been pushed into the water as a victim, but she rose from it, changed, baptized not by faith but by fire and will. The river had tested her, and she had lived. The man rose to his feet and offered her his hand once more. She hesitated, her eyes on that hand, the same one that had pulled her from death. There was mud on his skin, a cut along his knuckle, veins marked by labor and time. Something told her this was not the first time he had reached into darkness to save someone. "Where will you go?" he asked. She looked toward the ridge where the women had disappeared, then to the far valley where the river curved out of sight. "Away from here," she said softly. "Somewhere the river runs quiet." He nodded, understanding. But when he turned to leave, she stopped him. "Tell me your name," she said. He glanced back over his shoulder, a faint trace of a smile hidden in his tired face. "Names don't matter much," he said. "Only the things we do." And then he was gone, walking along the river bank until the dust swallowed him. She sat there for a long while, her wet dress clinging to her, her hair heavy with water, her heart heavier still. Yet beneath the ache, there was a strange calm, the kind that comes when a soul is remade. Behind her, the current carried away the footprints of those who had tried to destroy her. Ahead, the valley waited, silent and open. The river had taken many lives before hers, but that day it had given one back. She didn't yet know who the man was, or why he had appeared at that exact moment. But as the sky shifted from gold to blue, she felt his presence linger in the wind, a promise that this was not the end of her story, only the beginning, and somewhere downstream. A handprint remained on the stones, proof that even in the wildest current, there are forces stronger than the river itself. That night, the river hummed like it carried a memory too heavy to rest. She sat beside a small fire near the bank, her soaked dress now dry, her hair curling in the warmth, and her thoughts drifting between fear and disbelief. The stranger's words echoed through her mind, "Names don't matter much, only the things we do." She had heard men say 1,000 things to her before, but none had spoken like that, with a voice that felt carved from truth. Somewhere beyond the hills, wolves howled, and the wind moved through the cottonwoods like a whisper of unfinished fate. The town was a few miles behind her now, sleeping under its church bell and unspoken scenes. She imagined them waking at dawn, whispering over breakfast that she was gone, that the river had claimed her. They would weep false tears and pray for her soul, pretending not to remember the sound of their own laughter when they pushed her into the water. Perhaps they would even feel relief believing beauty had finally met its rightful punishment. Yet she knew she couldn't stay near that town, not after what had been done. They would not forgive her survival, because it proved something they refused to face, that she was stronger than their hate. Her hands trembled as she held them to the firelight. The skin was scraped and bruised, and the faint mark of his fingers still showed near her wrist. She pressed her thumb over it, feeling the warmth of that memory. Who was he? A rancher passing through? A trapper who lived by the river? There had been something in his eyes. Loneliness, perhaps, or understanding, the kind that comes only from carrying your own burdens too long. She had wanted to ask more, but he had vanished before she could even thank him properly. When the sun rose, she gathered her few things, a small shawl, a tin cup, and the dried bread from her pocket. The path ahead wound through low grass and silent trees. The river moved beside her like a companion, calm now but whispering of hidden depths. Each step away from the town felt like walking out of a shadow, though the pain of what had happened clung to her chest. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to find a place where no one knew her face by noon. She reached a clearing where a half-broken cabin leaned against a ridge. It looked abandoned, but the roof still stood, and smoke stains marked the stones of an old hearth. The ground was covered in wild daisies, and a creek branched off from the main river nearby. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that makes you listen to your own heartbeat. She decided to stay. Maybe just for a night. Maybe longer. Inside the cabin, she found signs that someone had lived there not too long ago, a few empty jars. A rope hung by the door, and an old rifle resting in the corner. Dust covered everything, yet the bed still held the faint outline of a blanket once folded neatly. She brushed the dirt off the table and placed her things down. For the first time since the river, she exhaled without shaking. Days passed slowly after that. She gathered wood, fetched water, and mended what she could. Her body healed, but her heart wrestled with silence. Each morning she walked to the riverbank where she had washed ashore, and each time she felt the pull of memory. The place no longer looked crewlit, looked alive, restless, like it had its own conscience. She would kneel and watch the current, half expecting that same hand to rise from it again. But the river remained still, carrying reflections of sky and sorrow alike. Then one morning, she saw footprints near the cabin. They were large, pressed deep into the earth, and led toward the back of the house. Her breath caught. She gripped the wooden spoon she was holding like a weapon and stepped outside. A shadow moved behind the trees. "You shouldn't walk barefoot out here," a voice said calmly. She turned on. There he was. The same man from the riverbank, holding the reins of a horse with one hand and a sack of supplies in the other. She froze, unsure whether to run or speak. He looked different in daylight, taller, leaner, with a quiet steadiness that came from solitude. His shirt was torn at the sleeve and there was dirt on his boots, as if he had been traveling for days. "You found this place?" he said, glancing at the cabin. "It's been empty a long while." "I used to stay here when the snows were bad. Is it yours?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No one's owned it in years. Folks stopped coming this far out. Too close to the river, they say." She studied him in silence. The same scar traced his jawline, and his eyes, though tired, carried warmth she didn't trust herself to believe in. "Why did you come back?" she asked. He set down the sack and shrugged lightly. "I figured you might need food. Or company." There was something disarming about his honesty. He didn't look at her like the townsfolk did not, with judgment or hunger. Just with a kind of quiet curiosity, as though he wanted to understand the story behind her silence. She hesitated, then motioned toward the cabin. "You can rest if you like," she said. "The river's calmer today." He smiled faintly. "It always calms after it takes what it wants." She looked away at that, her throat tightening. He seemed to realize his words had cut too close and changed the subject. "I'll fix the fence for you," he said after a pause. "It's falling apart. Won't take long." "You don't owe me anything," she replied, almost defensive. He met her gaze. "Maybe not. But sometimes helping someone is the only way a man remembers who he is." The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm. He repaired the fence, mended the roof, and caught fish from the creek. She baked bread, gathered herbs, and tended the small patch of land outside. They spoke little, yet their silence felt companionable. In the evenings, when the fire burned low, he would tell her stories of the frontier of men who lost themselves chasing gold, of settlers who disappeared into storms, of a world that had little mercy for anyone who stood alone. He never said where he came from, but she noticed the way he watched the horizon sometimes, as if expecting someone or something to find him. There was a heaviness in his eyes that spoke of unfinished reckonings. And though he never asked about her past, she could tell he already knew enough to understand why she avoided looking toward the town. One night, as the rain tapped gently against the roof, she asked, "Do you believe people can change?" He stared into the fire. "Change?" he repeated. Maybe, but not the way folks think. The river changes its shape every season, but it's still the same water underneath. People are like that. We bend, we break, but what's inside doesn't wash away so easily. His words lingered with her long after he fell asleep beside the dying fire. She thought about the women who had thrown her into the water, about their twisted faces and the fear behind their cruelty. Maybe envy had changed them. Maybe it had only revealed who they had been all along. The next morning, the sun rose, pale and uncertain, casting long shadows across the valley. From the ridge above, she could see smoke rising thin and gray from the direction of the town. Her stomach tightened. Something had happened. She wanted to turn away, but curiosity gripped her. He noticed her watching the smoke. You shouldn't go back, he said quietly. I just want to know what they're saying, she whispered. They'll say what they always do, he answered. Whatever keeps their own hands clean. But that night, as the wind grew colder, she couldn't sleep. The sound of the river was louder, restless. She stepped outside, barefoot on the damp earth, and walked toward the water. The moonlight shimmered on the current, silver and unyielding. She felt drawn to it again, not in fear, but in search of something she couldn't name. She knelt by the edge, staring at her reflection. The woman who looked back wasn't the same one who had fallen in days ago. Her eyes were sharper now, her shoulders straighter. She had lived through something meant to destroy her, and that made her dangerous in a new way. Behind her, the faint sound of hooves broke the quiet. She turned sharply, expecting to see him. But it wasn't him. A figure on horseback emerged from the shadows, riding slowly along the riverbank. The rider's coat was long, the hat pulled low, face hidden by the dim light. When the horse stopped, the rider dismounted and looked directly at her. You shouldn't be alive, the voice said, cold and familiar. Her breath caught. It was one of the women from the town, the same, who had pushed her first. But now her eyes were hollow, her hands trembling around a pistol. The river murmured between them like a warning. The night air thickened with tension, heavy with unfinished reckoning, and as the moon slipped behind the clouds, the only sound left was the steady heartbeat of the river and the memory of the hand that once pulled her from its depths. The air stood still between them, heavy with memory and unfinished judgment. The woman's voice trembled, but her hand holding the pistol did not. The moonlight flashed against the barrel, cold and unforgiving. You should have stayed beneath that river, she said again, her words quivering between guilt and hatred. You were supposed to be gone. For a moment no one moved. The only sound was the restless whisper of the river, brushing against the stones as if urging restraint. She stared back at her attacker, her heart pounding, yet something inside her had changed since that day in the water. Fear no longer ruled her. It had burned out, replaced by a calm that made her seem almost untouchable. You came all the way here to finish what you started, she asked, her tone steady but soft. The woman's eyes flickered with unease. You think you can come back? You think the town won't find out you're alive? She swallowed hard, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone had followed her. They'll say you bewitched him to the man who saved you. You'll ruin him the way you ruin everything. The mention of him, her chest tightened. The stranger, the man with the scar who had given her a second chance at life. She took a slow step forward, not caring that the pistol was pointed straight at her. He saved me because he had a soul, she said. You can't stand that someone like him could see good where you only saw envy. The other woman's jaw clenched. You think you know me? She hissed. You think you're the only one life's been cruel to? My husband left because of you. Every day I walk through that town, I hear your name like a curse. I never took anything from you, she said quietly. You gave him away the moment you let hatred make your choices. A flash of rage crossed the woman's face. The pistol shook. For a moment, it looked like she might fire, but the shot never came. From behind the trees came the sound of hooves and the crunch of footsteps. The stranger emerged from the shadows, his rifle slung across his shoulder. His eyes moved from her to the trembling woman holding the gun. Put it down, he said calmly. The woman startled, taking a step back. Stay out of this, she warned. You don't know what she is. I know what she isn't, he said, stepping closer. She isn't your enemy. The tension broke like lightning across the valley. The The woman's hand faltered. For a second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then she turned and ran, vanishing into the trees. The pistol clattered into the dirt. Silence returned, broken only by the sound of crickets and the slow rhythm of the river. He walked over and picked up the gun, then looked at her. "You all right?" She nodded, though her pulse still thudded beneath her skin. "She came to kill me," she whispered, "and I think she'll come back." He stared into the dark woods where the woman had disappeared. "She's afraid," he said finally. "Afraid of what you survived?" That night neither of them slept. They stayed near the fire, speaking little, listening to the wind move through the valley. She could see the strain on his face, the worry that her past was no longer just hers. She wanted to thank him for saving her again, but the words refused to form. Gratitude felt too small for what bound them now. By morning, clouds gathered over the ridge. The river darkened under the shadow of an approaching storm. He saddled his horse, ready to ride into town. She stopped him at the gate. "Don't go there," she said. "They'll turn on you too." He rested his hand on the saddle horn. "I can't stay out here forever," he said. "I've got things left undone." "Things?" she asked. He hesitated, his eyes distant. "A brother buried somewhere near those hills. A debt that never got paid. People like me can't run forever. You don't have to face them alone," she said, surprising herself with the words. He smiled faintly. That same quiet smile that made her chest ache. "You've got a good heart," he said. "But good hearts don't last long out here." When he rode off, she watched until the dust swallowed him. The cabin felt emptier than before. She tried to keep busy fetching water, mending clothes, but her thoughts drifted to the town beyond the ridge. She imagined the woman telling her story to others, twisting the truth into poison. She imagined the men with their rifles, the preacher whispering sermons about the wages of sin. The world beyond the river was readying itself, and she knew it would come for her again. That afternoon, thunder rolled across the valley. The sky broke open, pouring rain that turned the earth to mud. She stood by the doorway watching the downpour when movement caught her eye near the river. A figure struggled through the currenta, small one, maybe a child. Without thinking, she ran into the storm. The river was fierce again, swollen from the rain, but she could see the boy's face now, his arms flailing in panic. She dove in, the cold striking her like a wall. The current tugged hard, but she fought against it, reaching for him. Her fingers brushed his sleeve, and she gripped it tight, pulling with everything she had. They tumbled toward the shallows, gasping and coughing as they broke free of the water. The boy was no older than 10, drenched and shivering. "You're all right," she said, wrapping her shawl around him. "You're safe." He looked at her with wide eyes. "I came to find you," he stammered. "They said you were dead." Her breath caught. "Who said that?" "My ma," he whispered. "And the preacher. They said the river took you 'cause you were cursed. But I saw you once, near the market. You gave me bread when no one else would." She felt something twist in her chest. This child, born into the same town that had condemned her, had crossed the valley just to see if she was real. "How did you find me?" she asked. He pointed toward the woods. "A man told me. Said you'd be here?" Her heart skipped. "What man?" "He had a scar on his face," the boy said. "Said to tell you the town's changing. Said to tell you to stay near the river until he comes back." The storm raged harder around them, lightning splitting the sky. She led the boy inside, fed him, and wrapped him in a blanket. But her mind churned with questions. What did he mean, the town's changing? Was the stranger in danger? And how had he known the boy would come? As night fell, the boy slept near the fire while she sat awake, staring at the door. Every sound outside made her tense, the creak of a branch, the rush of wind. She couldn't shake the image of that woman's trembling hand holding the pistol. There was no safety now, not for her. It's not for anyone who stood beside her. In the middle of the night, she heard horses again. Not one, many. She doused the fire and peered through the window. Lanterns flickered along the ridge. Men rode in a slow line toward the valley, their faces hidden by the storm's veil. The boy stirred. "What's happening?" "Quiet," she whispered, pulling him close. The riders reached the edge of the clearing and stopped. Through the rain, She saw familiar shapesmen from the town, armed and grim. Their leader dismounted and shouted something she couldn't make out, but the tone was clear. Accusation. She crouched low, heart pounding. Come out. One of them yelled. We know you're there. The river didn't take you, but we will. The boy started to cry softly, and she pressed her hand over his mouth. The sound of boots splashing through mud grew closer. Then a rifle fired into the air, the echo shaking through the valley, and just as the men began to spread out, a shadow moved through the storm behind them. A horse galloped fast, its rider cutting through the rain like a ghost. The flash of lightning revealed the scarred face. She knew the stranger. Back again with his rifle drawn, he shouted something lost to the wind, and chaos erupted. The riders turned toward him, their torches flaring, their shouts swallowed by thunder. She pulled the boy deeper into the cabin as gunfire cracked in the night. The river roared louder, rising over its banks, as if the earth itself had chosen sides. Inside the cabin, she clutched the boy close and whispered a prayer not for herself, but for the man who had once pulled her from the river and now rode back into the storm to face a flood of another kind. Outside, the lanterns flickered and went out one by one, leaving only the wild cry of the wind and the echo of a hand stronger than the river itself. The rain poured harder, turning the valley into a blur of smoke and thunder. She crouched beside the boy near the hearth, her breath shallow as flashes of light split the night. Every crack of a gunshot echoed through her bones. Outside, the voices of men carried shouting orders, cursing, searching. Somewhere in that chaos, she heard the horse again, the one she knew belonged to him. Her heart pounded at the thought that he was out there alone, facing them all. The boy gripped her arm, trembling. Will they hurt him? He whispered. She hushed him, trying to stay calm, though fear pressed heavy on her chest. He knows what he's doing, she said softly, though she wasn't sure she believed it. He's not like them. Shadow passed by the window. She froze, every muscle tight. The door rattled once, then went still. Boots scraped against the porch. She held her breath. The latch began to move, slow and careful. Just as it lifted, a gun fired outside, and the man on the porch fell backward into the mud. She covered the boy's ears as the thunder swallowed the sound. The door flew open, and he burst and soaked, bleeding from his shoulder, his face hard with determination. They're circling the ridge, he said quickly. We have to move. You're hurt? She said, reaching for him. It's nothing, he replied, though his hand pressed against the wound. We can't stay here. They think you bewitched the river, that you brought the flood on purpose. The preachers turned them wild. The boy whimpered softly, and the man looked down, startled. Who's he? He found me in the storm, she said. Said you sent him. The man blinked, then gave a faint nod. Smart kid, he said. But they'll use him against you if they find out he's here. Lightning struck a nearby tree, the flash so bright it lit the entire cabin for an instant. She saw the fear in his eyes then, not for himself, but for her. He moved to the window and peered out. They're splitting up, he murmured. Half by the creek, half by the trail. We'll have to go through the river. The river, she echoed. They'll see us. They'll be looking in the wrong direction, he said. The current's strong, but it'll carry us far enough before they realize we're gone. He tore a strip from his coat and wrapped it around his shoulder. She helped him tighten it, her hands shaking as she worked. His skin was cold, and the blood soaked quickly through the fabric. You shouldn't be standing, she said, voice breaking. I've stood through worse, he answered. Trust me. He gathered what little they had, some bread, a blanket, a knife, and opened the door. The rain lashed against them immediately, cold and fierce. She took the boy's hand, and together they stepped into the night. The world beyond was chaos. The lanterns of the men glowed in the distance, their shouts carried on the wind. The ground was slippery with mud, and every step felt heavier than the last. When they reached the riverbank, the water was higher than before, wild and brown. It looked like it could swallow anything. She hesitated. It nearly killed me once, she whispered. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers through the storm. Then it owes you mercy, he said. and it owes me too. Without another word, he stepped in, holding the boy against his chest. She followed, the cold cutting through her like knives. The current tugged at her dress, pulling hard, but she kept close, watching his every move. He led them across the shallows, finding his footing where the rocks hid beneath the water. The sound of the river was deafening, constant roar that swallowed their breath. Halfway through, a shout rose behind them. A lantern flared on the bank they'd left. There, someone yelled, by the water. Gunfire split the air again. Bullets hit the surface, spraying water. She ducked, clutching the boy close. The man turned, firing one shot back, then another, his movements slow but sure. Keep moving, he shouted. The current caught her foot, dragging her sideways. She fell, the river swallowing her cry. The boy screamed, reaching for her, but the man lunged, catching her arm again the same way he had the first time. His fingers dug into her skin, and for a moment she thought she might lose him too. But he pulled with everything left in him until she was back on her feet. They stumbled toward the far bank, soaked and gasping. The world behind them was still shouting, but the sound was fading. When they reached solid ground, she collapsed, clutching the earth. The boy was crying quietly against her shoulder. The man stood over them, chest heaving, watching the ridgeline. "They'll keep coming," he said. "They won't stop until one of us is gone." She looked up at him, the rain streaking his face. "Then what do we do?" He didn't answer. Instead, he knelt and placed a hand on her cheek, his eyes filled with something fierce and unspoken. "You survive," he said. "No matter what happens, you keep living. You hear me?" Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him that she wouldn't leave him, that she couldn't. But before she could speak, distant horns sounded from the ridge, the kind used by the riders to signal a call to arms. "They've found the trail," he said grimly. "We have minutes." They moved fast, cutting through the trees along the river. The forest grew thicker, the light dimmer, branches snagging their clothes. The boy stumbled, but she carried him when his legs gave out. The man led them up a rocky path toward a hollow where the cliffs met. There an old mine entrance gaped in the hillside, half collapsed but deep enough to hide them for the night. Inside, the air smelled of dust and rusted tools. They huddled near a wooden beam while thunder rolled outside. The man slumped against the wall, pale and breathing hard. She knelt beside him, pressing her hand over his shoulder wound. The bleeding hadn't stopped. "You're losing too much blood," she said. "Let me help," he gave a weak smile. "You already did," he murmured. "Twice now." The boy leaned close, eyes wide. "Will he die?" She shook her head quickly. "No," she said. "Not tonight." Inside, the sound of horses grew louder again. Torches flickered at the edge of the trees. The men had followed the river, spreading out across the valley. She could hear their leader shouting orders, his voice sharp, commanding. It was the preacher. She recognized the rhythm of his tone. The same voice that had told the town her beauty was a curse. The preacher's voice carried into the storm. Find her, the witch and her savior both. Let no sin escape this night. Her stomach turned cold. The man opened his eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. "If they reach us here, we'll never make it out." "I won't let them take you," she said. "Not after everything." He reached for her hand, gripping it weakly. "You don't owe me that." "I owe you more than life," she said, tears mixing with rain and fear. The boy tugged at her sleeve, pointing toward the back of the cave. "There's another way out," he whispered. "A tunnel. I saw it." She turned, and indeed there was a narrow opening leading deeper into the rock, half hidden behind old timbers. She looked back at the man. "Can you walk?" He nodded once, though his face betrayed the pain. She helped him up, slinging his arm over her shoulder. They moved through the tunnel slowly, the boy leading the way with a small lantern he'd found. The air grew colder the deeper they went. Behind them, the sound of footsteps entered the mine. The preacher's men had found their trail. Voices echoed. Torches lit the dark entrance. "This way." One of them shouted. "Keep moving," he said, his voice strained. "We're close." The tunnel narrowed until they had to crouch. Rocks scraped against their backs. The boy stumbled, nearly dropping the lantern. The light flickered, shadows stretching across the walls like reaching hands. Then, ahead they saw a faint shimmer of moonlight through a crack. The tunnel opened onto the far side of the ridge, where the river curved again below. But as they neared the opening, a gunshot rang out. The bullet hit the rock beside her, sending sparks into the air. The preacher's silhouette filled the tunnel behind them, his torch blazing, his face twisted with fury. "You cannot run from judgment," he bellowed. "The river spared you, but God won't." The man raised his rifle, though his arm shook with exhaustion. She pulled the boy behind her, her breath caught between terror and resolve. The preacher stepped closer, firelight glinting off the pistol in his hand. The storm raged above them, thunder rolling across the valley. The river roared below, the same one that had once tried to take her. And as lightning flashed, illuminating their faces in brief bursts of white, she realized everything had come full circle. The same water, the same fear, the same impossible choice between surrender and survival. The preacher took another step forward. The man steadied his aim, his hand trembling. The boy clutched her tightly, whispering a prayer through his tears. And then the mountain itself seemed to groan, as if it, too, had a stake in what came next. Stones loosened from above. The tunnels shuddered. And all around them, the world held its breath, waiting for the moment when fate would decide whose hand was stronger, the one that condemned, or the one that saved. The mountain trembled. Dust falling from the ceiling of the tunnel as the storm outside roared louder than ever. The preacher stood near the entrance, shouting words drowned by thunder, his torchlight throwing wild shadows against the walls. The man with the scar raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the rocks above gave way. The ground shook beneath them. The preacher's voice turned to a scream as the tunnel collapsed, swallowing his light and sealing the entrance behind a wall of stone and dirt. The echo of it carried for a long while, then faded into silence. She didn't move at first. The air was thick with dust, her heart pounding in her ears. The boy clung to her waist, coughing. Beside her, the man lowered his weapon slowly, his shoulders trembling from pain and exhaustion. He met her eyes through the dim lantern glow, and for the first time since the river, he looked at peace. "It's over," he whispered. Though the words carried more weariness than triumph, they stumbled toward the narrow opening at the far end of the cave. The night greeted them with cold air and a faint glow from the storm's retreat. Rain still fell, soft and steady, washing the mud from the rocks. The world outside was quiet now, no voices, no horses, no sound of pursuit. Only the steady murmur of the river below. Calm again, as if nothing had happened. They made their way down the slope, moving slow. The man leaned on her shoulder, his steps uneven. When they reached the riverbank, he sank to his knees, the color drained from his face. She knelt beside him, holding his hands, her heart tight with fear. "You're bleeding again," she said. "Please, let me help." He gave a faint smile. "You've helped enough," he murmured. "The rest is just life doing what it does." "Don't talk like that," she said, her voice shaking. "You'll be fine once we reach the cabin." He didn't argue, but his gaze drifted to the water. The reflection of the clouds shimmered across the surface, and in it, his eyes seemed softer, as if he saw something beyond her sight. "Funny thing about rivers," he said quietly. "They take everything we throw into them, grief, anger, hope, and somehow keep moving, carrying it all like it's nothing." The boy sat beside them, silent and wide-eyed. He had seen too much for his years. She brushed the wet hair from his forehead and looked back at the man. "You can rest once we get there," she said again, more to convince herself than him. They walked until dawn, following the edge of the water. The rain had stopped, and a thin mist hung low over the valley. When the first light broke through the clouds, they finally saw smoke rising ahead, their cabin still standing, though half the fence was gone. She felt a strange sense of homecoming, the kind that comes not from safety but from survival. Inside, she set him by the fire and tore a strip from her dress to bandage his shoulder again. The boy fetched water, his small hands trembling but determined. The man stayed quiet, watching them, his breathing uneven. She pressed a hand against his chest, feeling the slow beat beneath. "You're safe now," she whispered. "No one's coming." He looked at her then. Really looked, his eyes tracing the lines of her face. The strength that had carried her through every storm. "You should leave this valley," he said. "Find somewhere no one knows your name. Start over." "And what about you?" she asked. He smiled faintly, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll stay here a while longer. Rivers don't stop until they've run their course." Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him everything she had kept inside since that night by the river, the gratitude, the fear, the quiet love that had grown between every word they hadn't said. But before she could, his eyes closed. His breathing slowed, then steadied, as if sleep had finally claimed him. She sat beside him, her hands still on his. Watching the firelight flicker across his scar, the boy came to her side and leaned against her. "Will he wake?" he asked softly. She hesitated. "He's resting," she said. "He earned it." The day passed quietly. She stepped outside once to fetch more wood, the valley stretching before her like a world reborn. The sky was clear now, the air crisp and new. The river gleamed silver under the morning sun. She stood there for a long time, letting the warmth touch her face, thinking about all the things that had brought her envy, cruelty, forgiveness, fate. By evening, she buried him beneath the willow tree near the river bank. The boy helped her gather stones for the grave, his small hands careful with each one. When it was done, she stood over the mound of earth, her heart heavy, but still. The river whispered nearby, its voice soft. Carrying away the echoes of everything they had endured, she spoke quietly, more to the wind than to herself. "You said names don't matter," she murmured. "But yours does, because it saved mine." The boy reached for her hand. "What will we do now?" "We'll live," she said simply. That's what he wanted. Days turned into weeks. The town never came. Whether they thought she had vanished again, or the preacher's story had died with him, she didn't know. She rebuilt the cabin, taught the boy how to fish, how to plant corn along the riverbank. He grew stronger with each passing day, his laughter echoing across the valley that once knew only fear. Sometimes she would catch herself smiling without reason. It would surprise her. The boy often asked about the man, where he came from, what he had done before all this. She never had clear answers, but she told him what mattered, that he had been brave, that he had believed kindness was worth fighting for, and that some hands are stronger not because of force, but because they hold on when everything else lets go. As summer came, the river ran low and gentle. One evening, she walked to its edge alone. The water shimmered gold with the setting sun. She knelt and let her fingers trail through it, feeling the cool rush against her skin. The same current that had tried to end her life now felt like an old friend. She closed her eyes, remembering the moment that hand had pulled her from the depths of warmth. The promise, the strength that had refused to let her go. She whispered into the wind, "You were right. The river doesn't stop. Neither do we." Behind her, the boy called her name, holding up a small fish he had caught. She smiled and turned, walking back toward the cabin. The valley glowed in the soft orange light of evening. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, curling into the open sky. For the first time, she felt no weight in her chest, no fear of what might come. The river's song followed her, steady and endless, like a heartbeat that belonged to them both. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would sometimes speak of a woman who lived by the water with a boy she had raised as her own. They said she was quiet but kind, that her eyes held the kind of calm that comes only from surviving storms. Some claimed they'd seen her standing by the river at dusk, talking softly to the wind as if to someone unseen, and though no one ever saw the man again, the locals said the river still carried a mark where he had once pulled her to safety, a bend where the current slowed, gentle and deep, like it bowed to the memory of what had happened there. She never told the boy everything about that night. Some stories, she believed, belonged to the earth and the water that bore them. But when he was grown, she told him this much: there's a strength greater than fear, and it's the strength that holds us when the world tries to drown us. Remember that no matter where life takes you. He did remember, and so did the river. It flowed on through seasons and silence, carrying both sorrow and grace, a reminder that even out of envy and violence, something pure could rise again. The woman who once was cast into the water lived her days not as a ghost of her past, but as a keeper of its lesson, that no matter how cold the current, there is always a hand, somewhere strong enough to lift you back into the light. And when her story finally ended, the river carried her reflection gently away, back into the same current that had once tested her, leaving behind only peace and the echo of a promise kept by the one whose hand was stronger than the river.